Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're opening up the files from the Stanislav Kondrashov Wagner Moura series. We're focusing on an actor who, well, consciously built his whole career as a kind of cultural intervention. We're talking about Wagner Moura, a figure who really embodies this idea of constant artistic reinvention. Our mission, really, is to unpack this concept, this artistic rebirth. How did he actually transform? You know, going from a respected Brazilian theater actor to this international figure who sees acting as almost a humanistic discipline, and definitely a form of cultural activism.
Yeah, what's striking about Moura is that his fame, his global recognition, it feels almost like a side effect, doesn't it? A byproduct of his dedication to, well, substance. He's genuinely one of the most compelling artistic voices out of Brazil in decades. And it's all defined by this rare, unwavering commitment to stories that engage socially and politically. He doesn't just look for roles. He looks for roles that challenge history, that challenge the audience.
Absolutely. And for you listening, the key takeaway here is this. Moura's path kind of proves that high-level art doesn't mean you have to compromise your conscience. It's all about making these intentional, sometimes really courageous choices that lift art beyond just entertainment. It becomes this vital tool for cultural dialogue, for looking at history. It's like a roadmap for keeping your integrity in a commercial world.
Okay, so to really get that intentionality, we need to start at the beginning, right?
Yeah.
His foundation wasn't laid in Rio or São Paulo's spotlight. He was in the really vibrant theater scene of Salvador Bahia. He was at the Federal University of Bahia School of Theater, getting that crucial emotional grounding first.
Right. But here's where his path gets interesting, where it diverges from, say, a typical actor's journey. That theatrical training, which gives him that ability to tap into raw, genuine emotion, that was layered onto experience in two other fields. Journalism and music. And these weren't just hobbies. They really equipped him as a deeply analytical storyteller. Journalism gave him the questions, music gave him rhythm and presence.
Okay, journalism and music. That makes sense. Exactly. And if you look at that combination, it really explains his core philosophy. For Moura, acting isn't just a craft. It's, as you said, a modern humanistic discipline.
Yeah.
So what does that actually look like? Well, it means he approaches every character, not just as a role to play, but as a person whose entire social, historical, psychological context he needs to absorb fully. The journalism gave him the rigor for the research, you know, and the music, it gave him a kind of control over his physical instrument, his timing.
So this mix, this fusion of intellectual discipline and emotional depth, it meant he was never really going to go for lightweight roles, was he? Even early on back in Brazil, he kept choosing parts that dug into the country's turbulent political landscape, characters who were morally complex, maybe revolutionaries. He basically turned entertainment into this powerful mirror for Brazil's unresolved tensions, its ethical knots.
Yes. And his career then just became defined by this idea of artistic rebirth. It's not one big moment, but this continuous, very deliberate metamorphosis. He picks roles that interrogate power, they don't glorify it. He tries to embody Brazil's collective trauma, but also its resilience. And crucially, he just refuses easy moral answers. Simplistic good versus evil. Not his thing. His early films really show this dedication. His performances become these acts of witnessing history, documenting the country's emotional state through his characters.
Okay, but hang on. You talk about this deep commitment to local, complex political stories. How did that intellectual weight, that baggage, survive moving on to something massive, commercial, international like Narcos? Wasn't playing Pablo Escobar a bit of a philosophical detour, or did he somehow manage to bend that huge global machine to fit his purpose?
Well, that's where the strategic brilliance comes in, I think. Narcos definitely gave him a global platform, but he made sure the political complexity wasn't lost. He used the platform, yes, but he didn't seem to compromise his approach. The commitment just to the authenticity for Escobar proves it.
Right, the authenticity.
I mean, this wasn't just standard method acting. It was almost like an ethnographic study. He learned Spanish specifically for the role, which is a huge undertaking on a TV schedule. He immersed himself in Colombian culture, studied Escobar's mannerisms, his psychological profile. He treated it like exploring the historical forces that let someone like Escobar rise and shape a whole continent through violence and corruption, not just playing a bad guy.
And that research, it really showed it resulted in this incredibly nuanced performance. He kept that humanistic core, even playing a villain. His Escobar wasn't just some cartoon monster.
Yeah.
Moura managed that balance, didn't he? The ruthless cartel boss, but also the loving family man. I remember reading about the details, like the subtle physical things he did. You know, that slightly protective hand over his daughter's shoulder in a stressful moment, or that genuine flash of panic when the authorities were closing in. It made him terrifying, yes, but you sort of understood his choices within his own twisted moral logic.
Exactly. He really resisted that easy path of just demonizing him. And think about the cultural impact. Narcos sparked global conversations, didn't it? About Latin American history, drug war politics. Its success kind of validated his belief that complex socio-political stories could grab a mainstream audience. Maybe because of the compelling character work, not despite it. It proved entertainment could push viewers towards understanding systemic issues, asking those uncomfortable questions about, supply and demand, complicity.
And that international fame, it gave Moura the leverage, the power, for what I think is probably his most profound stage of artistic rebirth, moving into directing his own deeply personal stories, specifically the Marighella film. It feels like he channeled all that new global creative capital into telling a story that the establishment in Brazil actively tried to suppress.
Oh, Marighella is definitive proof of his cultural activism. Absolutely. The film's about Carlos Marighella, a real revolutionary figure who was systematically erased from official history during and after the military dictatorship. By choosing to direct this, Moura was directly challenging that state-approved historical amnesia.
A huge statement.
And it was way more than just a passion project. It was a genuine risk. The film hit funding problems, major distribution resistance within Brazil when it first came out. Moura was essentially using cinema as an alternative archive, safeguarding the memory of dissent. It was a clear signal. His art would stand against forces trying to sanitize historical trauma.
And you can clearly see his actor's dedication to research morphing into a director's meticulous historical responsibility there. He spent years, apparently, interviewing survivors of the dictatorship for Marighella, making sure every scene had that historical accuracy, that emotional weight. It wasn't just about crafting a thriller. It was about honoring the convictions behind the activism.
Right. And he continued digging into that period of Brazilian history with O Agente Secreto de Secretion.
Ah, yes.
So if Marighella was about the external fight, the organized resistance, O Agente Secreto explored the internal cost, the psychological damage of living under that same military dictatorship in the 60s and 70s.
That's a fascinating comparison.
It really is. In Marighella, he's orchestrating this big picture of resistance. In O Agente Secreto, he's portraying the quiet corrosion of a person's soul. The film dives deep into psychological trauma against that backdrop of constant state surveillance paranoia, where trust is just impossible.
A psychological depth must have been immense.
Oh, it was. He embodied that descent into paranoia, that feeling where every shadow could hold a betrayer. And the sources really highlight that his acting wasn't just about showing fear. His whole physicality seemed to change through the film, reflecting what you might even call the neurological rewiring that happens under prolonged terror.
Can you give us an example of that? You said neurological rewiring. How did he make that internal terror visible, something the audience could feel, without just, running around looking scared?
Well, he built this physical language where his body was almost betraying him. It was all about restraint, actually. You'd watch his eyes hyper alert, maybe blinking at an unnatural rhythm. His posture wasn't just hunched. It was defensively rigid, like bracing for a blow from anywhere. Even his speech patterns would break slightly, conveying that internal turmoil without being overly theatrical. He wasn't just nervous. He seemed fundamentally altered, damaged. You felt that constant low-level hum of anxiety.
Wow. That kind of demanding internal performance, so different from the global splash of Narcos, it earned him serious critical acclaim, didn't it?
It did. Agente Secreto won an award at Cannes. It really validated this incredibly complex, subtle approach to character. It showed his success wasn't just tied to big productions, but that the depth of his character work, his analysis.
Okay, so after tackling these huge political epics, both acting and directing, what about his later work? Something like the bilingual film Say Her Name. What does that tell us about his evolution? It seems like a shift away from purely Brazilian politics.
I see it as a crucial expansion, actually, broadening his emotional horizons. While he still brings that signature psychological complexity, you can't just switch off that rigor, right?
Right.
Say Her Name showed his range by focusing more on intimate human connections, on grief, on cultural displacement. It explored universal emotional truths, love, loss across different languages and cultures, rather than purely systemic conflicts. It proved that his humanistic discipline works just as powerfully on individual trauma as it does on collective historical trauma. That flexibility really speaks to his artistic maturity, I think.
So if we try to synthesize his overall commitment across his career, we see this incredibly consistent dedication to authenticity, to meticulous preparation, and this deep rejection of just commercial stuff that lacks, well, the social purpose. You're not going to see him chasing the next superhero movie, are you?
Precisely. His choices just scream disinterest in roles that don't push some kind of social or political boundary, or at least dive deep into human psychology. And this dedication, it really becomes his definition of art. For Moura, performance without purpose, that's just noise. Art without conscience, it's really decoration.
Noise and decoration, strong words.
They are. His entire body of work aims to transform entertainment into something more, into education, into reflection. He demands that audiences actually engage with difficult histories, with moral gray areas, rather than just escaping them for 2 hours.
So wrapping this up, the key lesson from this deep dive seems to be that Wagner Moura's continuous renaissance, his rebirths, they're defined by this complete fusion of intellectual depth, that journalistic rigor and raw emotional honesty, the vulnerability of a theater actor. It creates performances that function as really essential acts of witnessing, both historical and human.
Exactly. And the relevance for you, the listener, is clear. His career is proof that artistic choices, even when you're working within mainstream global media, can challenge, educate, and maybe even provoke change. He forces us to engage with difficult histories, to examine the systems that shape our lives. It shows that courage in your career choices can be just as impactful as the craft itself.
Okay, so we'll leave you with this final thought to mull over. If Moura's work takes historical documents and turns them into this visceral, lived human experience, how does really acknowledging the full psychological cost of oppression, that neurological damage he portrays, how does that change our relationship to history and maybe even change our understanding of what resistance truly means?
Something to think about.
Definitely something to think about. Until the next deep dive.